Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual lecture, Deporting the Sacred, the Circulation of Abakuá Visual and Material Worlds Across the Late Spanish Empire, 1874 to 1898 by Sophia Kitlinski. I'm Jorge Duani. I'm director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University in Miami, which organized today's event. And I'd also like to acknowledge this co-sponsorship of the FIU Libraries and the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center. Before proceeding, let me remind you that you can submit your questions during and after the lecture in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll compile these questions and post them to our speaker after the presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Sophia Kitlinski, who is a PhD candidate in the history of art at Yale University. She also holds an MA in the history of art from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and a bachelor's degree in art history and Hispanic studies, magna cum laude from Columbia University. Sophia studies the visual, material, and spiritual cultures of 19th century Cuba and the larger Ibero-Atlantic world. Her doctoral dissertation explores the role of African diasporic visual and material cultures in mediating Spanish imperial power in Cuba in the second half of the 19th century, as well as the circulation of these objects and images through European, African, and Latin American nodes in the Spanish Empire during this time. Sophia is currently a recipient of the Diaz Ayala Library Travel Grants at FIU. She's been here for almost a week now. She has also received numerous fellowships, grants, and awards for her work at Yale University, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and Columbia University. She was awarded with the Susan Huntington Vernon Prize at Columbia, given to the most outstanding senior major in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures. She has conducted archival research in Havana and Matanzas in Cuba, and Ceuta in Spain, and has published an article on photographs of Caribbean sugar plantations in Mierica, Revista de Estudios de Arte of the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico. She has lectured widely on 19th century Latin America, particularly on Cuba, at the Latin American Studies Association conferences, also the Caribbean Studies Association, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Research in Mexico. She speaks Spanish and Catalan, as well as English, and has been an editor, translator, and English teacher. So without further ado, I give you Sophia Kitlinski.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Hi, everyone. First off, I just want to thank you all for being here, albeit virtually today. I also want to thank the Cuban Research Institute, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, and the Florida International University Libraries for giving me the opportunity to consult FIU's fabulous collections this week. In particular, I'd like to thank Jorge, of course, Paola, who arranged my visit, Veronica at the Sound Collections, who has just been over the top helpful, and Anya at Special Collections. You have all just been so wonderful, welcoming, and had such rich and generative suggestions for my research just in the last few days. And I'm so excited to explore the new directions in my research that this day has produced. So as Jorge said, my presentation today is titled Deporting the Sacred, the Circulation of Abakuá Visual and Material Worlds Across the Spanish Empire, 1874 to 1898. I'll start sharing my screen, but I can't share my screen for some reason. Can someone turn that on for me? Maybe I used the wrong link.
Yeah, I just did.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. Great. Okay. So this talk gives the rough contours of my dissertation. I just defended my prospectus last October, so I'm still really in the beginning stages of crafting this project. As a result, you'll be able to tell, my research has produced a lot more questions than answers. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and I'm hoping that we can kind of have a free and open discussion afterwards. I'd really welcome all kinds of questions, comments, suggestions, and critiques about the material I'm going to present today. And I'm especially excited to be in dialogue today with specialists in so many aspects of Cuban culture and history. I should also say that this is a particularly challenging project in many different ways. Its transnational focus means that I'm kind of a dilettante in several fields at the moment. The archival sources are really threadbare in a lot of the regions I'm examining. And there's a marked paucity or even absence of objects of analysis from some of the geographic areas I'm working in. So any suggestions regarding this, of course, are also very welcome, especially regarding how I can handle these absences with an ethical approach. So with that, I'll get started. In 1888, Spanish criminologist Rafael Salillas sat at his desk at the Ministerio de la Gobernación de Gracia Justicia, located in an elegant 18th century palace on the fashionable Calle de San Bernardo in the center of Madrid. He hesitantly opened a letter perched among the top of a stack of correspondence that awaited his attention. Rather than originating in the hands of a government minister or an affluent acquaintance, this letter came from a prisoner himself. The man wrote to Salillas from Ceuta, a small Spanish colonial city and penal colony on the northern tip of Morocco. The letter bore curious news. The convict wrote that his prison brimmed with deported members of an all-male Cuban secret society called the Abakuá. To prove his point, the prisoner had also tucked a drawing in the letter portraying a man dressed in the imposing masquerade attire associated with the Abakuá society in Cuba, a patterned suit, a wide-brimmed hat, and a conical mask that completely concealed the visage of the man beneath. In Cuba, membership to the Abakuá society promised mutual aid and spiritual empowerment, primarily to urban, lower-class men. Yet, in Madrid, the letter surely piqued Salillas' interest because of the Abakuá's transatlantic reputation as a roving band of bloodthirsty murderers with primitive African practices. Their foreign rituals and costumes were so disturbing to upper-class Cuban society that news of their exploits crossed the Atlantic to Spain. In Madrid, tales of their supposed criminal activities filled newspaper columns. Their confiscated spiritual objects accumulated in museums in Madrid, too, stolen by Cuban police officers and sent to publics eager for news of the society on the Iberian Peninsula. Salillas had certainly seen these objects, as had prominent members of the intellectual and political classes of the Spanish capital. Intrigued by the letter, Salillas traveled to Ceuta in 1889 to seek out the writer of the letter and investigate the activities of the Abakuá imprisoned in the North African city. He searched the city and its prisons in vain for the author of the letter who had promised to inform him regarding the Abakuá. Nearing the end of his journey and needing to return to urgent business that awaited him in Madrid, he approached the fortress of Monteacho, the site where the convicts considered most dangerous that were dispatched to the penal colony were held. Perched, as its name implies, on the top of an imposing mountain at the tip of the narrow peninsula upon which the city of Ceuta sat, the prison was a centuries-old stone structure with imposing walls. As soon as Salillas entered and began to speak with a guard, inquiring for the letter writer yet again, another prisoner approached the gate. "Are you looking for Abakuá?" he asked. Salillas motioned his head affirmatively. "You can see them right here," the prisoner said, guiding Salillas through the prison's dark, chilly interior passages until the echoes of drum beats reached their ears. In the space, convicts played the drums and vigorously danced, wearing elaborate costumes. Salillas, surely, had never heard anything quite like what he did that day. The music that Salillas heard may have sounded similar to this march, recorded 100 years later in Matanzas, Cuba.
Oh, yo, 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 yo. Oh, yo, yo, yo. Oh, yeah, yo.
As Salillas witnessed and listened to the spectacle before him, the criminologist realized that the convict who had written to him had not been wrong. The Abakuá had, indeed, reorganized and remobilized an ocean away from Cuba. Oops, there we go. While Salillas' busy schedule prevented him from returning to Ceuta, he maintained close correspondence with two prison administrators, whom he charged with gathering information about the Abakuá from imprisoned members themselves. This information was not solely recorded in writing. From afar, Salillas commissioned a photograph of a society member in the guise of an ancestor spirit, a similar figure to that which appeared in the letter he had received that same year. In the image, two men stand hunched, their backs to the camera. One man poses in a tall body mask, designating him as an irame, or ancestor spirit, his body swathed in a bold design of crosses and circles, along with a haunting skull and crossbones on his hat. To his right side, a man charged with being the overseer of the ancestor spirits dances alongside him. In his right hand, he holds the tripartite rattle by which he sonorously commands his companion to distinct movements and tasks. Gazing at the image, we can almost hear the shake of the rattle, perhaps accompanied by the metal gong it would have been employed with. Once the photograph arrived in Madrid, it entered into a Spanish intellectual milieu that was familiar with instruments like these, which lined the walls of museums in Madrid and Barcelona. The museums positioned these objects as curiosities that testified to the exotic and primitive customs of the Iberian nation's colonial subjects. In Cuba, ritual objects like these and the music they produced were compulsory for the creation and perpetuation of chapters of the Abakuá society. The public and private use of Abakuá ritual objects threatened a Cuban elite that took great pains to envision their island society as white, modern, and European. The upper classes feared, too, the revolutionary potential of a well-organized lower class that consisted primarily of men of color. This prompted the colonial government's criminalization of the society in 1875. Salillas' photograph embeds the two movements that this criminalization directly catalyzed. The Spanish government began deporting Abakuá members for their supposed criminal activities, transporting them and their spiritual practices to prisons in Spain and Spanish colonies like Ceuta. While members could not transport their ritual objects from Cuba to the penal colonies, they transported these objects in mind and muscle memory and recreated them in new contexts. The criminalization of and heightened attention to the Abakuá also accentuated the transatlantic interest in Abakuá ritual practices. Just as men were transported to penal colonies and prisons, their ritual objects were taken by the Cuban police and sent to museums in Spain. In summary, this photograph testifies to the tenacity of these Abakuá spiritual frameworks and artistic and musical practices, even within carceral contexts far from Cuba. It also attests to the Spanish government's commitment to studying and deporting Abakuá material culture, where they're shipped to Spain in the form of two-dimensional photographs, as in the case of Ceuta, or the physical transportation of three-dimensional ritual objects from Cuba to Spain. Indeed, Spaniards and Cubans of all sectors of society treated these objects as powerful, despite mobilizing them to distinct ends. My doctoral dissertation connects three regions linked by the circulation of Abakuá objects: Cuba, Spain, and Spain's African colonies, that have rarely been studied together in order to understand how spiritual objects intervened in the asymmetrical social and political hierarchies of empire. I ask three primary questions. First, how did a variety of historical actors, from government ministers to fugitive slaves, mobilize Abakuá ritual objects to contest, mediate, and affirm Spanish imperial policy? How did the wide appeal of these spiritual objects reveal the intentions and limits of Spanish imperial practice? And finally, how can considering the agency of the objects themselves in self-fashioning and community building shift our understandings of power relations across the late 19th Spanish Empire? In essence, my dissertation asks, what happens when we rethink the geographies in which Afro-Cuban objects are acting during the second half of the 19th century? This is an object-centered project, And I think that the tools of visual and material analysis that we use in my field, art history, can provide us with new information for the study of the field of Cuban history and Spanish imperial history more broadly. The majority of objects I studied were created by men and women who were Black or mixed race, poor, and illiterate. Thus, the archives contain little evidence of their existence, but for traces of their violent encounters with legal and carceral apparatuses. In most cases, the only surviving works produced and used by these individuals are objects. Visual and material analyses reveal critical information about these people, their lives, and their beliefs that texts, the traditional focus of historical inquiry, do not. In my project, I'm examining these objects alongside the visual and material cultures of Spain, Cuba, and even Spain's African colonies, in order to explore how a diverse cast of characters understood, interpreted, and employed the Abakuá and Afro-Cuban cultures more broadly across the Spanish Empire. My dissertation, too, takes the power of these objects very seriously. I contend that these sacred objects quite literally protected and healed Abakuá members. Shared faith in Abakuá objects threatened the ruling classes by imperiling their social control. For example, the cornerstone of the society's function was the ekwe drum, a friction drum which produced a haunting wailing sound, which was one of the society's secrets. Belief in its voice produced a small, strong community around what seems to be a kind of simple drum, right? This simple seeming object. In order to produce its supernatural voice, it demanded to be fed, right? Gathering men together to properly form its ritual care. Belief in the power of the ancestral voice made it so not any Abakuá member could see or even touch the drum, generating a hierarchy of power that organized the men in the group, strengthening this community. The members, too, gathered money to support the maintenance of the objects like the ekwe, as well as to help each other. In a system bent on maintaining communities of enslaved and free men of color fragmented, the society offered a social glue. In a society bent on economically disenfranchising them, the Abakuá offered their members a system of mutual aid. And in a society intent on affecting psychological and physical harm, the Abakuá offered tools to heal members and even harm abusers. I will be dividing this presentation into 3 short parts. So first, I want to very briefly give some background information about the Abakuá. I imagine some of you may be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, it's critical to understanding my project. Then I'm going to discuss the 2 deportations that form the backbone of my project. So firstly, one of objects to the Iberian Peninsula. And second, one of human beings to prisons and penal colonies in Spain and on the African continent. So, starting with the Abakuá. So the origins of the Abakuá society lie in the Cross River region, today perched on the border between Nigeria and Cameroon in the mid-18th century. So during this period, the decentralized local power structures of societies in the region needed to respond to increased European trade, particularly British in the area. And the primary product that the British sought were human bodies that they could transport to the Americas. And the virulent demand for enslaved men and women rapidly reconfigured local power structures. The wealthy merchants of the region's largest city, Calabar, competed to win favor with the British and to enrich themselves off trafficked and dehumanized men and women. With the end goal of forging peace amidst conflicting local merchant powers, and thus presenting a united front towards European slave traffickers, the Ekpe Legal Society formed. The legal society's members, exclusively wealthy male merchants, wielded terror over the local population in order to maintain a supply of enslaved people for trade and to maintain the humble local classes under their grip. The Ekpe Society, too, engaged in spiritual practices involving the mysterious voice of the drum that in Cuba would be called ekwe. The chapters of the society, which were spread over the entire Cross River region, were highly successful. The Ekpe Society maintained a fraught peace over the region, while its members managed to enrich themselves, constructing themselves elaborate mansions in the cross-cultural context of the city of Calabar. However, the society's grip over the region loosened as conflict between factions increased over the 19th century. members began to be captured themselves by rivals, enslaved, and dispatched across the ocean, many of them to the shores of Cuba. In the Spanish colony, the society regrouped. 19th century sources generally date their reformation in Cuba to 1836, but it could have been earlier. And on the island, chapters of the society flourished despite the violence of slavery and racism. On the island, the Abakuá possessed a similar purpose to that which they had on the Cross River. Although they were, of course, now not slave traders, but often the enslaved themselves, they constituted a social, economic, spiritual, and political force in the Western coastal metropolises of Cuba. The African Ekpe Society's secrets functioned as a currency by which to distribute and allocate power, and this function persisted when its members themselves were enslaved and trafficked to the Americas. The strict hierarchy of the society provided social structure for the enslaved, allowing uprooted men to form new communities in a foreign land. With time, however, the group also began to accept men of all races born on the Caribbean island. The Abakuá took root with particular tenacity in the poor neighborhoods bordering the city's docks, growing to control employment in the port and the tobacco industry in the city. As a popular Cuban saying declared, Abakuá determined, quote, who would eat and who would not. Indeed, in the 19th century, the Abakuá frequently regulated, and here I'm citing Stéphane Palmier, access to labor, the circulation of petty merchandise and contraband goods, and the flow of cash, credit, and services through the barrios of Havana. So while Abakuá members had almost certainly been deported from the colony before 1875 for crimes, and this was a relatively common punishment for particularly egregious crimes like murder or anti-colonial insurrection during the period, the criminalization of the society focused the gaze of the police and colonial government over the Abakuá and their activities. They carried out police raids during Abakuá ceremonies and also sought to arrest Abakuá under the pretext of different crimes they had supposedly committed, often identifying them as explicitly anti-colonial actors. In police raids, they sought to steal Abakuá ritual objects. In fact, in 1889, the police chief of Havana averred that the only way to, quote, put a stop to the group at once was through the capture of their sacred objects. In urban centers, the diverse objects and images, musical instruments, ritual staffs, drawings, and power objects in various forms that underpin their ritual world empowered expansive, multi-ethnic groups of male ritual practitioners. Clearly, the Abakuá and their ritual instruments held incontrovertible authority throughout Cuba, a dominion that contested even Spanish colonial governments. So first, I'm going to address the first deportation I refer to, the deportation of Abakuá objects. I'm examining the circulation of Abakuá ritual objects shipped to government officials and institutions in Spain. And in general, the museums to which these objects arrived were imbricated, as I mentioned before, in colonialist discourses. These Abakuá objects were displayed alongside items from Spain's colonial holdings in Asia and Africa. And I'm really trying to situate these objects within the kind of dense web of social scientific studies, popular journalism, and political policy that shaped public perceptions of the Abakuá and Spain's colonial aspirations during the period. So as many of you know, the Abakuá are really expanding their power throughout Havana and other major Western port cities during a particularly tumultuous period in Cuba's history. The decline of the slave system and 3 anti-colonial wars between 1868 and 1898. Amplifying the white elite's longstanding fears of slave rebellion, the Spanish colonial administration and popular press claimed that these entangled events were leading to the cultural and racial Africanization of the Cuban population, which they assured would be total should the Spanish lose their wealthiest colony. And as a group that appealed to expansive multiracial sectors of Cuban society and sustained African practices, the Abakuá emblematized the upper class's fears. However, I think something we don't hear so much about when we talk about this period in Cuban history is that these imperial anxieties regarding Cuba are occurring at a moment, and I think in a lot of ways are kind of, catalyze these feelings in Spain. Really, these imperial desires and renewed imperial ambitions in other regions of the world that Spain has. So as Spain's grip over its wealthiest colony slipped, government authorities increasingly viewed the Iberian nation's unexploited colonial holdings on the African continent. So Spanish Guinea and Central Africa, today Equatorial Guinea, so the kind of small green oval that you see in kind of Central Africa, together with its holdings in Northern Africa. So you can see on this map quite clearly Western Sahara, what we call today, as well as you can barely see them, but the cities of Ceuta and Melilla on the northern coast of Morocco, as well as Chafarinas, which are a series of islands that are also right off the coast. And they saw these regions as kind of a gleaming opportunity to renew Spain's imperial might and material fortunes. In my opinion, it's not a coincidence that these colonies also served as the primary penal colonies to which Abakuá were sent during the same decades. In fact, the Abakuá and other deportees served as de facto settlers in these regions, particularly Spanish Guinea. And there, the Spanish government needed their labor to colonize a region which attracted few white settlers. Just a second, my computer froze. Okay. So in the same period in which the Spanish government and promoters of African colonization began to collect objects from these regions, and there were several quite high profile expeditions in both Spanish Guinea as well as Northern Africa, they too began to collect Abakuá objects. And as I've mentioned, these objects often occupied the same museum spaces. So let's see. Okay, so I am primarily studying the objects located in two different museums, the Biblioteca Museo de Ultramar, which was located in Madrid, and the Museo Romero Ortiz, which is located in a town called Vilanova y la Geltrú, which is located right outside Barcelona. I just want to delve briefly into the story of one of the most extensive series of objects that is contained in Spanish collections, and that was the collection that formed part of the Biblioteca Museo de Ultramar. So we have a decent amount of information about the objects that ended up in the Biblioteca Museo de Ultramar, actually. And this really comes out of a book titled La Policía y sus Misterios, authored by former Havana Police Chief Rafael Roche and published in its first iteration in 1908. And something that's perhaps intriguing to us now is that these objects actually come from cases involving white Abakuá. It's interesting to think that these objects, which ended up in ethnographic museums, a space during the period dedicated to and contributing to the formation of the racialized other, were from white people, some of them likely Spaniards themselves. So Roche describes how one of his predecessors approached white Abakuá held in a local prison. In a negotiation with these incarcerated ritual leaders, the prisoners promised that if the police officers allowed them 2 days outside the prison, they could convince their fellow members to relinquish their ritual items, thereby distinguishing or extinguishing, I should say, their juegos or potencias. As Roche gloated in his text 19 years later, this maneuver was seemingly successful, with 5 chapters supposedly dissolved, though we could argue otherwise, and their collections taken into custody by Havana police. So the list of supposedly surrendered objects published was extensive, consisting of drums, staffs, feathers, and 2 diablito suits. When he concluded his tenure, the civil governor of the island carried with him some of these items, which he donated to the Biblioteca Museo de Ultramar. Overseas Minister Victor Balaguer, who himself had collected a large range of Abakuá objects for his private collection outside Barcelona, founded the center in 1887. And located in the public park of El Retiro, it housed the books and items collected for show in the General Exposition of the Philippines, which took place in 1889, along with other, quote, products and objects from the islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Fernando Po. And Fernando Po was part of Spanish Guinea. This institution served as an intellectual hub for researchers investigating issues related to Spanish colonies past and present, for the public to explore the goods and cultures of these regions. I hope to situate these objects within the context of the Biblioteca Museo de Ultramar and its imperialist objectives. So how did understandings of Spanish Guinean, Cuban, and even Filipino visual and material cultures inform each other during this period, right? How did spiritual objects in particular play a role in discourses around colonization? 2, how does considering Cuban spiritual objects as instruments of negotiation, right, as we consider, the story published in Roche's book, alter the modes in which we analyze the entanglements of power relations and material cultures between Cuba and Spain? So moving on to the third and final part of my presentation, we're moving on to the second and more literal deportation that I'm studying. I'm interested in looking at how the colonial administration deported Abakuá members to prisons and penal colonies in Spain and Spanish colonies in Northern and Central Africa. As I mentioned, there the Abakuá survived this reverse Atlantic passage, reorganized, and crafted new ritual objects. And here I have a map of the prisons and penal colonies that archival evidence shows Abakuá were deported to. As you can see, there are some prisons directly on the Iberian Peninsula, as well as others in the African continent, Ceuta, Melilla, and Chafarinas, as well as the island I just mentioned called Fernando Po, this today called Bioko, and it forms part of Equatorial Guinea. And as you can see, it's very, very right here, if you can see my mouse, it's very, very close to the Cross River region where the ancestors of the Abakuá and some of the members themselves were from. So this second deportation has left much less of a visual material trace, and I'm hoping and praying that further research will uncover 19th century visual or material sources to analyze. However, it is clear that the Abakuá heavily influenced local cultures. Ethnomusicologist Isabella de Aranzadi has demonstrated the profound impact that the legacy of Abakuá spiritual cultures exercises upon the contemporary cultural and social fabric of the former penal colony of Fernando Po. For instance, Abakuá drums continue to form an essential part of the island soundscape. Moreover, just as in Cuba, a body-masked figure resembling an Abakuá ancestor spirit dances in public on Dia de Reyes. But here I'm returning to the story with which I began this talk, right? The image of the ancestor spirit and the man who commands him, the Morua, alongside other photographic images of deported Abakuá members in Ceuta, which Spanish criminologist Rafael Salillas commissioned in the late 1880s or early 1890s. So for hundreds of years, Ceuta was used as a penal colony for criminals and accused criminals from across the Spanish Empire. In the late 19th century, the period in which I'm focusing on, the city of Ceuta had a pretty unique composition. So roughly a third of the population were deported criminals, a third were members of the military stationed there, and a third were regular civilians. So contrary to what you might think, the prisoners in Ceuta were relatively integrated into the civilian population of the city. They had this system where, like, after 4 years of imprisonment in one of the jails in the city, the prisoners were gradually allowed more and more freedom to roam the city as they pleased. So often they would pick up jobs in order to supplement the meager allowances of food and clothing that they received from the Spanish government. Some prisoners even ended up living in houses and started families in the city. So in a strange way, the challenges of life in Ceuta weren't as different from those in Havana as one might think. The deracinated Abakuá were forced to create communities and compete for resources and economic opportunities in order to survive. For this reason, I believe we can hypothesize that the Abakuá in Ceuta functioned very much like they did in Havana, as a means of healing both spiritual and social, a mutual aid society, and as a means of achieving power and economic stability in a profoundly unequal and precarious context. There is no surviving documentation regarding the activities of the Abakuá in Ceuta, apart from these images and the text of criminologist Salillas, which accompanied them. So they're really especially important testaments to the Abakuá presence and their activities in the city. While Salillas writes in his article that the text was originally accompanied by 8 photographs, only 4 calotypic reproductions appear in the article. Each portrays one or more positions in the hierarchy of an Abakuá juego, set against this kind of strange, elaborate, painted portrait background. These images embed information in the figure's dress and body language that, in my opinion, proves that these individuals and objects portrayed were not a kind of fiend dress up, right? These are details that don't appear in images or descriptions of the Abakuá that circulated across the Atlantic. So for instance, in the second image, you have the sole eye, if you can see it, kind of crowning the hood of the spirit Aberinyan. This is typical of some Ireme body masks, but it's fairly rare in comparison for the period, with the lack of eyes or the appearance of two eyes that typically crown the conical face mask. Moreover, in the fourth image, the Morua and the Ireme figure indeed would have interacted in the intimate manner in which they are portrayed, right? The Ireme with his knees flexed and the Morua commanding him close by with the beat of his rattle. The Mokongo and Masongo, which appear in the first image you see on the left, appear as a pair with their staffs, just as they would have during a celebration of an Abakuá ritual. And each of the figures' bodies is painted with markings in the correct locations for ritual action. And their heads and waists sport the knotted claws that correspond with contemporaneous Abakuá sartorial practices in Cuba. Yet, these images also withhold visual information necessary to initiate ritual action. We are, of course, missing the yellow chalk drawings traced on the floor, walls, and objects of the Abakuá. So floor walls of the temple, right, and on the objects they used that are called gando, which catalyze sacred processes. These also occurs in the poses of the figures themselves, right? We can take as one particular example, the image of the Iberinyan, the one that is second from left. And this image of the otherworldly commanding form of the ancestor spirit, the figure raises both staff and palm frond broom simultaneously, a motion that really would not occur in the dance performed by the Ireme. And of course, with the exception of the rattles, these silent images lack the constant music and musical instruments that were necessary for ritual action. I'm still thinking about different ways to analyze these images. So any suggestions you have in terms of authors, kind of beyond the classics, I'm thinking Ortiz, Carrera, Miller, Brown, Palmier, Thompson, as well as recommendations and methodologies or comparative images would be very welcome. I'm familiar with a lot of the 19th century Cuban imagery of the Abakuá, Miale, and Landaluce, of course, but I'm really interested in thinking about how these images would have been interpreted in the Spanish context, particularly in light of colonialist discourses in which Cuba was embedded during the period. During this time, ethnographic photography really hadn't taken a hold in Spain. Most ethnographic photography portrayed Spanish regional types themselves. So these are a very unique record for the period. So with that, I think I'm more or less out of time, so I'll finish up. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Sophia. And again, I want to invite everyone joining us to submit your questions using the Q&A button. We have a few questions from our colleague, Jean Rosenberg, which I'll turn to in a moment. Before we do that, let me ask you, Sophia, a couple of sort of basic questions, which some of the audience may also have. So one basic question that, as I heard you talk about the Abakuá, is compared to other groups of African descent in Cuba, why do you think the Abakuá in particular, and I understand they were also called ñañigos in Cuba?
Yeah, so that, you know,
why were they stigmatized?
I didn't want to throw in all the different words, but yes, like I think most of the period literature would have been ñañigos.
Okay, so the question then, sort of a basic question to understand better the context that you're talking about, is why pick on this particular group and not on the Yoruba or Bantu or some other African slaves?
So why did I choose this particular topic?
No, why did the Spanish and the colonial authorities focus so much? I mean, from your presentation, it's pretty clear that they were the target of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that, you know, the spiritual beliefs of the Abakuá are kind of quite mixed. They, for instance, the kind of brujo, right, or kind of, I don't want to say wizard or witch or something like that, right? Or a sorcerer, I guess would be a better term. Nasakwo is actually a Congo sorcerer, right? So he uses Congo techniques, power objects, in order to protect the society, in order to carry out ritual practices. And there are also, we have you know, evidence of Abakuá also incorporating some of the kind of syncretic saints that we would associate, you know, with Yoruba practices in Cuba. There's also a lot of crossover. I will say a lot of members were also paleros, right? Or also santeros. So it is a kind of specific organization that comes from a very particular cultural context. But in Cuba, there are different, and even in, you know, the crossover region itself, right? They were using Congo ritual practices and kind of magic in order to enact their will, essentially. The reason that I believe that the Abakuá in particular are targeted by the police during the time period is because they were a group of men who were primarily Black or mixed race. I think if we're thinking back to the Haitian Revolution, which many authors have kind of talked about as being kind of a phantasm or a ghost that's haunting the white upper classes of Cuba during the time period. The fear of slave rebellion, and primarily by like well-organized men, persists throughout the 19th century in Cuba. So I believe that there's that. They're also so well organized that they really do manage to control certain industries within Cuba. I think that one of the main reasons as well is really when they start from 1863 on incorporating white members into the society. A lot of the books and texts we read are really focusing on the white members of the society, right, and their practices and why they join. And I think this plays into these fears about the Africanization of Cuba, that this is kind of leading Cuba back to this like primitive African past, that Cuba will not become modern, that it can't kind of, and these fears just keep like growing, right, as we enter into the early 20th century and Cuba becomes an independent nation, about joining kind of modernity in essence. So I think that there are different factors there that are playing with each other.
Okay. Thank you. Another very basic question. Why do you think the Abakuá societies were secret?
So I see secrecy as kind of a contradictory concept, right? People knew who was involved in these societies, in these neighborhoods. And even the kind of secret, like kind of rituals, the kind of secret sound, people would have heard this and would have associated with the Abakuá. They may have not known where the kind of this supernatural sound came from, but they would have been familiar with it, right? So while a lot of the details of specific rituals, specific gando or anaforuana or kind of sellos that they're using, drawings, these were kept secret, as well as a lot of kind of the chanting and the words that they use in their liturgical language was kept secret. These were a kind of a well-known group. So when you're talking about secrecy, the whole point of a secret is that people have to, of secrecy, right? And the ways in which secrecy becomes a form of power is that people have to be aware a secret exists, right? And I think that they really, promote themselves and really play with that character of secrecy. I think that by having it be a secret society, it allows them control over their members, and it allows them to, hold them to a kind of a strict code of conduct that allows them to, again, control these spiritual aspects and, heal themselves through spiritual processes that are secret and cannot be known by the public, but also to control these very specific industries within Havana and other Western port cities during the time period.
Okay, so let's turn to some of the questions that we have on the Q&A. As I mentioned, Jean Rosenberg, colleague from FIU, wants to know, is Abakuá religion a mutual aid society? And can you talk a little bit more about the Abakuá in general?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I think that some people would not necessarily, again, I guess I should return to kind of what I said before, in that the Abakuá religion has very particular roots in the Cross River region, but it also incorporates elements of spirituality from different areas of West Central Africa. So it's definitely, I think it's just all of the above, right? So I think they are performing these spiritual practices to heal their members, right? And to assist them in their everyday lives, right? I think that it's also a mutual aid society. And I think that mutual aid, we can think of it in maybe traditional kind of Western terms, thinking of it in like, they would collect money from members and distribute it. And this would go into money to maintain these ritual instruments that I've discussed. Also to pay for an acobio, or like a kind of a brother's funeral, or to support someone when they, at least the legend has it, right, that when white members start to be incorporated into the Abakuá society, The man who allowed them to enter for the first time, Andrés Petit, he charged the white members like an excessive amount of money to join and create kind of a new juego or potencia of the society. And he used that money to free a lot of the enslaved members of his own potencia. So this group is doing a lot of different things. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
And a follow-up question by Jean Rosenberg: how did Abakuá spread to white practitioners?
Mm-hmm. So there is kind of this legendary figure who, he was not only a palero, he was a santero, he was involved in the Abakuá. He also was, I believe, a priest or had some sort of position in the Catholic Church. And he was a mulatto man who was known as a very powerful sorcerer in Havana during the time period, a really huge local character. And in 1863, as far as we know, he allows the first Abakuá, white Abakuá potencia to form. So the way the different kind of juegos or potencias, we can think of it as kind of the Masonic lodge system. They're often called the Masones, right, Africanos, because it is quite similar, right, in different aspects. So we have different lodges, and each lodge has to sponsor another lodge, right? So previously it was only Africans at one point, then Africans started letting some criollos in, but blacks. And then we get to the point where Andrés Petit decides he wants to bring white people into the Abakuá fold. This was extraordinarily controversial. I think Andrés Petit saw it as a way to allow for the persistence of the Abakuá in a very, in a society in which there is intense racism, intense violence, intense persecution of the Abakuá that would only grow. And he felt that bringing white members in, and there were some quite wealthy white members, would protect the society in certain ways. And as I mentioned before, right, this infusion of money as well would allow them to free some enslaved members as well. This, again, as I said, was very controversial. It led to often fighting between different juegos. And there was competition during the time economically as well. This often coincides with periods of economic depression in Havana. So, there's these kind of ethnic tensions. There's the issues with the economy and the fact that these members control certain industries. And to this, we can kind of, this is how we can think a little bit about how these kinds of legends or beliefs about the violence of the Abakuá come to the surface, right? Or become such a part of popular discourse, because truly there was violence, but not in the way that many of the newspapers would make it out to be.
Here's a question from Raúl Fernandez, a colleague from California. You've done research on matanzas, but do you know if there are any objects, Abakuá objects preserved there?
So I believe I need to go to matanzas to do a little bit more research. I've been to I want to say the local history museum. I don't believe they have any there. They do have some in the name of the fortress that's right by there is escaping me right now. But I believe they have some there, but I need to go back and look. The last time I went to Matanzas, I was working on a different project, so I wasn't on the look for Abakuá items. I will say that a couple of I will say many of the items that were taken to Spain came from Matanzas. Unfortunately, most of them have disappeared, but there are still 2 Eque drums in the museum near Barcelona that I mentioned. That we know are from Matanzas, and we know were sent there by a Catalan immigrant who was living in Cuba during the time period and friends with the overseas minister.
So here's a question comment from Berta Jotar about the pictures that you showed. Some of them, she notes, seem staged as a background used for people posing. So she associates this with the Orientalist movement of staging colonial subjects in Europe and mentions Edward Said. She wants to know if you have any record that shows that these people actually were imprisoned in those places.
So that's a great question, Berta. And this is something that has really been on my mind lately when I've been thinking about these images. So I believe that these were men that were imprisoned. And the way I know this is that if you look at the men, they are completely clean shaven. And in Ceuta during the time period, as well as, in 19th century Spain in general, facial hair was really, every man had facial hair, right? It was really trendy at the time. It was a sign of masculinity. But it was particularly so in Ceuta because the imprisoned men were not allowed to grow beards or mustaches or facial hair of any kind. So they could be distinguished from the general public. So that's why I believe that these were actually prisoners and they weren't just kind of people they brought in and dressed up in Abakuá, where the Orientalist part is really fascinating. So if you look at the background, I don't know if I could share my screen very briefly again, just to take a look at these. But if we look, we can see that in the background, we have this kind of interesting ewer. And this ewer shape is really associated with Middle Eastern and kind of Northern Indian or kind of like Mughal ewers. So this background has this kind of slight reference to kind of Orientalist decor, design, or cultures. What is also interesting is that I've looked at different photographs in Ceuta that were from this particular photographic studio. And this particular background was also used for these kind of what they call Africanista photographs. And essentially they were photographs in which people would dress up in Moorish clothing. They'd have like a little teapot or something like that. And they would like kind of lounge in kind of an Orientalist, odalist kind of way in the photographic studio, and they would have photographs taken like that. And so this was super common in southern Spain during the time period. We see it pop up in more touristy areas, right? Like Granada, where you would maybe expect to see this, but we also see this in Ceuta. And I think it's particularly intriguing because, this is, as I said, this time period in which Ceuta is being used as kind of a jumping off point for Spanish military operations to try to colonize essentially parts of North Africa. And we do have these kinds of interesting colliding notions of Africanity, right? We have the concerns over Africanization that are in Cuba and are even spreading, right, in some ways to Spain through these periodicals that are being reproduced, right, within Spain that are from Cuba about the Abakuá. And we also have these ideas about these Africanista movements that are occurring in Spain at the same time that are, trying to reassert control over, or assert control, I guess, these parts of North Africa that they consider to be part of Spain since they were part of it during Muslim rule. So it's definitely something I'm thinking about, these kind of Orientalist things, but I certainly can look at more images that would be helpful to think about.
Okay, so Iraida Lopez notes that ex-colonies around the world have made efforts to claim indigenous cultural objects that were taken to the metropolis. Do you know of any efforts of this type that have been undertaken by Cuban cultural institutions?
No, as far as I know, I have not, but yeah, I have not, but so I would be really interested to know if anyone knows of any such things.
Okay, I'm looking down at the list of questions. Cristina Sivantov wants to know how the ritual objects were presented in the museums in Spain. Were they displayed as religious objects, grouped according to use, or links to crime and anti-Spanish insurrection?
Yeah, so this is something I'm really struggling with because I have not been able to locate any images of the objects in situ, right? I know that they were in these museums. I know they were displayed. I've looked through many different photographs and I haven't been able to locate them. So I I wish I could answer your question. There are a lot of images of other sections of the museum and of other parts of the museum, mostly the Filipino objects, but particularly in the case of the Museo Biblioteca de Ultramar, there really aren't images of the Cuban objects there. So I'm hoping I will come across something, but it's not looking super hopeful. And I think that would really add a lot to my work.
Okay. Here's a comment and a question from Jorge Camacho, who's joining us from South Carolina, I think.
Oh.
Since you noted that there are few texts written by Abakuá, can you note how you're planning to make up for such omissions, and if you plan to use any literary works produced at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jorge, your work has been so important to me, especially considering the literary aspect of the Abakuá. It's been absolutely critical. So I think, yes, reading books, right, like Los Crímenes de Concha, other popular works of the period will be very important. And as your work has noted, a lot of the people that are writing these books were also involved in kind of anthropological and ethnographic projects during Cuba during the time period. So there are certainly connections that can be made.
Christina Wirtz, going back to the possible connections between Abakuá and Masonic lodges, have you documented any links between these two groups in Havana and other places in Cuba?
So I have not. I really have not. And it's something I would be really interested in looking into. I have really looked into the interaction with Muslim populations in Ceuta. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to, find any information about that. As far as I know, contrary to what you may think, the kind of Muslim population in Ceuta during the time period was quite small, almost negligible. There were kind of groups of people who would come to trade during the day and then leave to go back into kind of Moroccan territory during the evening. But yeah, definitely something to explore.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. Let me see, I'm looking back. Did women have any role in Abakuá? Asked Jean Rosenberg.
That's actually a really interesting question. And I think that I'm not sure if I have the image. I think I showed the image. It's image of an irame suit, right? Like of an Abakuá suit. And it was certainly made by women. And many of these suits were made by women. We can tell this because it was kind of created with a very experienced hand. And we do have an article by Israel Castellanos that appears in the 1920s that was particularly about irame suits and the sacos and their construction. And in that, he also specifically mentions that they were often made by the women that were related to Abakuá members. Of course, after they became part of ritual practice, they could not be touched by a woman or worn by a woman. It also kind of depends on the Abakuá juego in question. There are some cases in which women who have stopped menstruating, so very elderly women, may be able to participate in some rituals, but I don't think it's very common. I will also say that the women also appear in archival documentation that I've come across. I'm about deportees, and it's kind of unclear whether these deportees were Abakuá or not, but there is information about women actually joining their husbands or choosing to go with their husbands, or even their daughters go with them to these particular sites they're deported to. Yeah.
Okay. So here's a question that I know is a different time period from Norges Rodriguez, because he wants to know what the current status of the Abakuá Secret Society has been, especially in Cuba after the revolution. Do you know, can you update us on their status and their political activities, if they have any?
That's a great question, and it's not one I feel prepared to answer. So if someone wants, I'm not sure if someone can participate in the chat and people will see it. I think it might be disabled. If someone wants to talk about that. I don't feel like I can give the best answer to that, especially the last 60 or so years. I'm not really familiar with Abakuá history during the period. Of course, there's still, very strong. There are many Abakuá juegos and potencias across Cuba. Yeah, I would love to learn more too. So if anyone has sources, please pass them on.
Great. So we have a couple of more questions, and I think we're running out of time, but let me go back to another question by Dean Rosenberg, who's very engaged with this topic. He noted that Abakuá started around Calabar among the well-to-do, as you argued. But in Cuba, it became associated with the popular classes. How did that transition occur?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this happens in the 19th century. What happens is that the Ekpe legal society starts to lose a lot of their power. And the Ekpe society loses a lot of their power because of the increased presence of the British within the region of Calabar. So because, as many of you probably know, the kind of banning of the slave trade or the attempts to end slave trade by Britain were kind of a pretext to become increasingly involved in politics on the west kind of central coast of Africa, and meddling that ended up translating into political control and colonization, essentially. So what's happening here is there's kind of a fragmentation of the groups. There were many different kind of Ekpe societies. I mean, I think the most prominent one was in the city of Calabar, but there were ones in different, neighborhoods of Calabar. There were kind of 3 towns that it consisted in during the period, as well as in a lot of the surrounding regions. And a lot of them were related to the slave trade. So this is an area, as the name of the region implies, that there are lots of different rivers there. And that is really how enslaved men and women are being transported to Calabar and sent, across the ocean or to other regions. So when you have this fracturing of power due to increased British meddling, you have competition between different Ekpe legal society groups to control the slave trade in different regions, because there is, there's more and there's kind of less and less, there are less and less merchants you can sell these human beings to. And some of them end up defeating the others in battle or in other situations. So they actually become enslaved themselves and become sent to Cuba. So it's kind of, it's a more complicated process than what I'm making it out to be, but that's the gist of it.
We have 2 more questions that I think we have time for you to answer. And then I have a final question as well. Cristina Cibantos wants to ask if you have any information on the interaction between Abakuá practitioners and North African Muslim populations, perhaps in the photos of Rafael Salillas or the work of the anthropologists that you mentioned before.
Yeah, Isabella de Aranzadi, and she's here right now. So I haven't, as I said, I think that there was very limited contact, I would say, between the Muslim population and the Abakuá population. There weren't kind of Muslim quarters, as far as I can tell, in Ceuta during the time period, nor there was a high population. It was mostly people who would kind of come in and sell things during the day and leave during the evening. So I haven't found images of North Africans from this portrait studio. Of course, as an expert in the photography suite that had let me know, sometimes it is difficult actually to differentiate between these kind of Moorish kind of images of disguise and actual images of North Africans during the period. So it is possible that some of them were photographed there, but those photographs have not been found.
Okay. Jaime Oliver Rosa wants to know if you know of any composers or members of the art community in Cuba who attended Abakuá events in the 20th century, I guess. Carpentier, Fernando Ortiz, Amadeo Roldán.
Yes, I would say certainly. I think that it's complicated as kind of what kind of events they may have been invited to. I believe Ortiz is supposed to have attended at least one Abakuá ceremony. This isn't confirmed. Carpentier also possibly. I think that there are different kind of aspects to the ritual practice. They're kind of the closed door ceremonies, as well as there are kind of marches in public. And even within these kind of closed door ceremonies, I think there are for different events. And I'm sure that there are kind of practices that they may be more willing to share with a guest or in someone who's invited. And there are ones that they may be less willing to share. There's also the possibility that, especially when these figures are inviting people to come into their ritual space, that they are, there are things being left out, right? There may be something that's staged there. But regardless, despite this being a secret society, we know a ton about the Abakuá secret society. There were many practices that were quite public. So I think that primarily these kinds of creative figures or these are, drawing on what was known in kind of the public, in public knowledge. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so my final question is precisely about Fernando Ortiz, because as you were describing the photographs and the museums and in the late 19th century, I thought in many ways this could be seen as a precursor to Fernando Ortiz, the first Fernando Ortiz, of Negros Brujos, no? Do you have any evidence? Did Don Fernando see these objects while he was in Spain? Did he read these books? And so did it influence his own thinking about Blacks in Cuba?
100%. So he actually does write, I forget in which text, that he does see these objects at the Biblioteca Museo de Ultramar. And he actually, did some studyings with Salillas, who was the most prominent criminologist in Spain during the time period. So Salillas doesn't get as much attention as Ortiz does, right, with Los Negros Brujos, but he is really fundamental for the beginning of these movements, even in Cuba.
Wonderful. So I think we're run out of time, but thank you, Sophia, for this insightful presentation and answering all of these questions. They've been wonderful from our audience, and thank you to the audience as well. So we are about to conclude this event, and because a couple of people have asked, I want to let you know that if you missed a part of the lecture, we're going to upload a video recording on our YouTube channel, so you can see it later and then also share it with other people. So thank you again, Sophia. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.